I parked my car at the grocery store off Highway 52 that Tuesday morning, thinking I'd grab milk and eggs before my shift at the county office. Then I saw him, my son, 51 years old, sleeping in the back seat of his Honda Accord in the far corner of the lot, his work suit crumpled against the window like a discarded flag. How does a mother walk up to that? How do you knock on your own child's car window and pretend the world hasn't just cracked wide open? And here's what kept looping through my head as I stood there with my purse digging into my shoulder. If my grandson saw this, what would his mother tell him about us? If this story has already touched your heart, subscribe now, leave a like, and tell me in the comments what city you're watching from. I didn't knock right away. I stood behind the concrete pillar near the cart return and watched him for maybe 5 minutes. His hair was too long. His face looked hollowed out. There was a gym bag wedged behind the driver's seat and what looked like a cooler on the passenger floor. The windows had that faint fog you get when someone's been breathing in a closed space all night. My hands wouldn't stop shaking. I dropped my keys twice before I finally walked over and tapped on the glass. He startled awake. For a second, he didn't recognize me. Then his face did this thing, this collapse, like he'd been holding himself together with wire and I'd just cut it. He opened the door and stood up, unfolding himself from that cramped space, and I could smell stale coffee and the cheap soap from gas station bathrooms. I asked him how long. He said 3 weeks. 3 weeks my son had been living in a parking lot while I drove past this same store twice a week, buying groceries, living my regular life, answering emails, microwaving leftovers, watching the evening news. He told me he couldn't come to my house. That was the part that made my stomach turn. Not couldn't because of pride, couldn't because of her, his ex-wife, Melissa. She told him if he showed up at my place, if he involved me, if he made this a family drama, she'd make sure he never saw Ryan again. Ryan, my 8-year-old grandson, the kid who used to sleep over every other weekend, who knew where I kept the good cookies, who drew me pictures of dinosaurs that I still had on my fridge. Ryan, who I hadn't seen in 2 months because Melissa said I was enabling dysfunction and contributing to an unstable environment. We stood there in the cold morning air between 2 rows of parked cars. A shopping cart rattled past. Someone's car alarm went off 3 rows over. I asked him what happened to the house. He said she got it in the divorce. I asked about the furniture, the savings, the retirement account he'd been paying into for 20 years at the distribution company. He said her family's lawyers made sure most of it went to securing Ryan's future and compensating for emotional distress. I asked what that meant. He said it meant her father's law firm knew every angle, and he'd been too tired and too broke to fight. But here's the part that stuck in my throat. He said Melissa's mother told Ryan that Daddy made bad choices, and now Daddy doesn't have a home because he's irresponsible. That Grandma, meaning me, encourages him to be irresponsible because I didn't teach him to respect marriage. My daughter-in-law's mother stood in her pristine living room with the marble countertops and the pool out back and told my grandson I was the reason his father failed. I asked him where he'd been showering. He said the gym down on Fletcher Avenue still had his old membership. I asked where he was eating. He said there was a diner that let him sit for a few hours if he ordered coffee and toast. I asked if he was still working. He said yes, but most of his paycheck went to child support and the payment plan Melissa's lawyers had structured to recover marital assets. He was making $42,000 a year and living in his car. I wanted to scream. I wanted to drive straight to Melissa's house, that beautiful 2-story colonial her parents bought them as a wedding gift, and bang on the door until someone admitted this was insane. But I knew what would happen. She'd call the police. She'd document it. She'd use it in court to prove I was unhinged, that our whole family was unhinged, that Ryan needed protection from our toxic influence. So I stood there in a grocery store parking lot doing math in my head. Could he stay with me? What would it cost her to make good on that threat? How much access to my grandson was I willing to risk to give my son a roof? He told me he'd figure it out. That's what he kept saying. I'll figure it out. Like he was still 25, and this was just a rough patch between jobs. But his hands were shaking when he said it, and there were circles under his eyes, so dark they looked like bruises. I asked him how much he had in his account. He said $217. Payday was Friday. That gave him 3 days. 3 days until another check came, and most of it vanished into Melissa's account while he ate toast at a diner and washed his face in a gym bathroom. I told him to get in my car. He said no. I told him I wasn't asking. He said Melissa would find out. I said I didn't care. That was a lie. I cared. I cared. Because Ryan's face flashed in my head, that little boy who used to climb into my lap and fall asleep watching cartoons. And I knew exactly what Melissa would do if she thought I was interfering. She'd cancel visits. She'd screen calls. She'd make sure Ryan heard a version of this story where his grandmother chose sides instead of choosing sanity. But I couldn't leave my son in a parking lot, so I made a choice. I told him he could shower at my place and eat a real meal. Just today. Just to get his bearings. We'd keep it quiet. We'd figure out the next move. He looked at me like I'd just offered him a lifeboat off a sinking ship. And that's when I realized how far he'd fallen. That a shower and scrambled eggs felt like mercy. We drove to my house in separate cars. I kept checking my rearview mirror to make sure he was still behind me. Part of me expected him to veer off, to change his mind, to decide that even this small act of help wasn't worth the risk. But he followed me all the way down Maple Street to my little ranch house with the blue shutters and the driveway that needed repaving. I'd lived there 32 years, raised him there, buried his father there when cancer took him 8 years ago. The house was paid off, but it needed work. The roof had a slow leak. The water heater made noises. It wasn't much, but it was mine, and it was clean, and it had hot water. He parked on the street instead of the driveway. That small choice told me everything. He didn't want Melissa's friends driving past and seeing his car at my house. I unlocked the front door, and we went inside. The place still smelled like the coffee I'd made at 5 that morning. His old high school photo was still on the mantel. I told him the bathroom was exactly where it had always been. He nodded and disappeared down the hall. I heard the water start. I heard it run for a long time. I stood in my kitchen trying to think. Eggs, toast, orange juice. Simple. I could make that. But my mind kept spinning. How did this happen? How did my son, who worked every day, who never missed a child support payment, who showed up to every one of Ryan's school events until Melissa banned him, end up living in his car? And why had it taken me 3 weeks to find out? He must have been hiding. He must have been parking in different lots, moving around, making sure no one saw him, making sure I didn't see him. The water shut off. I cracked eggs into a pan. I heard him moving in the bathroom, heard the medicine cabinet open and close. He came out 20 minutes later in the same wrinkled suit, but with wet hair and a clean-shaven face. He looked 10 years younger and also somehow more lost. I put the food in front of him. He ate like he hadn't seen a hot meal in days. Maybe he hadn't. I asked him what the plan was. He said he didn't have one yet. He was trying to save enough for a security deposit on an apartment, but it would take months at this rate. Every time he got close, something came up. A car repair, a court filing fee, another expense Melissa's lawyer said he owed. He'd tried asking his boss for an advance. They said no. He'd tried asking Melissa if they could renegotiate the payment schedule. She said he should have thought about that before he abandoned his family. I felt my jaw tighten. He hadn't abandoned anyone. She'd had an affair with a pharmaceutical sales rep she met at Ryan's soccer practice. The whole town knew. But somehow in the divorce, in the paperwork and the mediation sessions and the lawyers' conference rooms, that detail got buried under language about irreconcilable differences and mutual breakdown of communication. Melissa's father made sure the narrative shifted. He made sure people remembered my son's long hours at work, his missed dinners, his tired face at Ryan's games. He made sure people forgot his daughter had been sleeping with someone else for 8 months. My son pushed his plate away. He said he appreciated the meal. He said he should get going. I asked where he was going. He said back to the lot. He had work at noon. I looked at the clock on the stove. It was 9:45. I asked him why he couldn't rest here for another hour. He said Melissa's sister drove past my house sometimes on her way to the country club gym. If she saw his car, if she texted Melissa, if Melissa decided this counted as me inserting myself into the situation, then the next court date could go very badly for him. I felt something cold settle into my chest. This was what it had come to. My son couldn't sit in my living room because his ex-wife's family had eyes everywhere and consequences for everything. I asked him when he'd last seen Ryan. He said 6 weeks ago. A supervised visit at a family resource center downtown where a social worker sat in the corner taking notes. Ryan had been quiet, distant. He'd asked why Daddy didn't live in the house anymore. My son tried to explain it in 8-year-old terms. The social worker wrote something down. Ryan asked if Daddy didn't love Mommy anymore. My son said love was complicated. The social worker wrote more notes. After 45 minutes, Melissa came to pick Ryan up. She didn't look at my son. She didn't say a word. She just took Ryan's hand and walked out. The next supervised visit was supposed to be in 2 weeks. That gave him 2 weeks to somehow look stable enough that a social worker wouldn't flag him as unfit. 2 weeks to hide the fact that he was living in his car, that he was showering at a gym, that he was one missed paycheck away from losing even that. I asked him if Melissa knew about the car. He said no. If she knew, she'd file an emergency motion to suspend his visitation rights entirely. I asked him what he needed. He said time. He said money he didn't have. He said proof that he could provide a stable home environment for partial custody. I asked what Melissa wanted. He said full custody. No overnight visits. Supervised daytime contact only. Child support increased to account for Ryan's elevated needs because living in a single-parent household was stressful for a child of divorce. Her lawyer had actually put that in the filings, as if Ryan's stress came from not having his father around, instead of from watching his mother rewrite history. I asked if there was anything else I could do. He said no. He said this was his problem to solve. He stood up, thanked me again, and walked toward the door. I watched him go. I watched him get into his car and drive away. Then I sat down at my kitchen table and cried for the first time in 8 years. Not since my husband's funeral. Not since I'd stood in a cemetery and promised I'd take care of our boy. And here he was, 51 years old, living in a parking lot, and I couldn't even let him stay for an extra hour without risking his access to his own son. But I'm a county clerk. I've worked in the records office for 23 years. I know how to find documents. I know what gets filed and where. I know that divorce settlements are public record. I know that affidavits and financial disclosures don't lie. And I know that Melissa's family had money and lawyers and a very polished story, but stories only work if no one checks the details. So I waited until Monday morning. I waited until I was calm. I waited until I could think clearly. Then I made a phone call. I called Melissa's father's law firm, not to speak to him. I called the main line and asked for a copy of the case file for my son's divorce. Public record. They tried to stall. They said I'd need to submit a formal request. I said I'd already submitted it online through the county portal, and I was calling to confirm receipt. There was a pause. Then they said they'd send it. 3 days later, a thick envelope arrived at my house. I opened it at my kitchen table with my reading glasses on and my coffee going cold. The financial disclosures told a very different story than the one Melissa had been selling. She'd claimed my son had hidden assets. She'd claimed he'd emptied their joint savings account before filing for divorce. She'd claimed he'd stopped contributing to household expenses months before he moved out. But the bank statements told the truth. Every paycheck deposited. Every bill paid on time. The joint savings account showed one large withdrawal, $8,000 taken by Melissa 2 weeks before she filed, moved into an account under her name only. The mortgage payments showed my son covering the full amount even after he moved out, even after she'd filed, right up until the judge awarded her the house. Her affidavit claimed my son had been verbally abusive, that he'd created an emotionally unsafe environment for Ryan, that he'd refused marriage counseling. But the attached emails showed the opposite. My son begging for couples therapy, Melissa saying she was too busy, my son asking if they could sit down and talk, Melissa responding with one-word answers or not responding at all. And then, buried in the exhibits, a text message thread between Melissa and the pharmaceutical rep. Months of messages, plans to meet, excuses for why she'd be late coming home. A message where she called my son a placeholder and said she was just waiting for the right time to leave. The custody evaluation report was even worse. It recommended shared custody, equal time. It noted that my son had been the primary parent for Ryan's first 4 years when Melissa was building her real estate career. It noted that Ryan had a strong bond with his father. It noted that there was no evidence of abuse or neglect. But Melissa's lawyer had filed a motion to disregard the evaluation, claiming the evaluator had been biased and hadn't properly considered the child's need for stability during a difficult transition. The judge, apparently a golfing buddy of Melissa's father, agreed. Shared custody became supervised visits. Equal time became every other Saturday for 2 hours. I sat there with pages spread across my table and felt something shift inside me. This wasn't a divorce. This was an execution. Melissa's family had used their money and their connections to bury my son. They'd made sure he lost the house, the savings, his time with Ryan, and his reputation. They'd made sure the story everyone heard was that he'd failed as a husband and father. They'd made sure I looked like an enabler. And they'd done it all with paperwork and affidavits and a judge who signed off on everything without asking hard questions. I thought about my grandson, about Ryan sitting in Melissa's living room hearing that his father was irresponsible, that his grandmother made bad choices, that our family couldn't be trusted. I thought about the supervised visit in 2 weeks. I thought about my son living in his car, trying to look stable enough to spend 2 hours with his own child. I thought about the envelope in front of me, full of proof that none of this had to happen this way. And I made a decision. I made copies, all of it. The bank statements, the texts, the emails, the custody evaluation, the financial disclosures. I put them in a folder. Then I called someone I hadn't spoken to in 15 years, my ex-sister-in-law, my late husband's sister, a family lawyer in the state capitol who'd moved away after her brother's funeral and never looked back. We'd had a falling out over the estate. Small stuff, hurt feelings, but she was good at her job, and she didn't like bullies. She answered on the 3rd ring. I told her I needed help. I told her it was about her nephew. She was quiet for a long moment. Then she asked what happened. I told her everything. The car, the parking lot, the divorce file, the supervised visits, the threats about Ryan. When I finished, she said one word: bastards. Then she said she'd review the file. She said if what I was describing was accurate, there were grounds to reopen the custody agreement. She said it would take time. She said it would cost money neither of us had. I said I'd figure out the money. She said she'd call me back in 48 hours. 2 days later, she called. She said the case was worse than I'd described. She said Melissa's father's firm had committed what she called procedural misconduct. They'd submitted financial documents that didn't match the county records. They'd claimed my son had missed child support payments when the bank records showed every payment cleared on time. They'd told the judge my son had refused to provide his employment information when the file showed he'd submitted it 3 times. She said any competent attorney would have caught this. She asked why my son's lawyer hadn't fought harder. I said he'd used a public defender because he couldn't afford anyone else. She made a sound like she was biting back a curse. She said we had 2 options. We could file a motion to modify the custody arrangement based on new evidence. That would take 6 months minimum, cost around $15,000, and require my son to prove he now had stable housing and income. Or we could do something faster and messier. We could file a complaint against Melissa's father's law firm with the state bar for misconduct and simultaneously request an emergency review of the custody order based on fraudulent evidence. That would take 30 days, cost around $8,000, and would blow up every relationship we still had with Melissa's family. It would also make us targets. Her father had connections. He'd fight back. He'd make noise. He'd try to discredit us before the bar even reviewed the complaint. I asked which option gave my son the best chance of seeing his kid. She said the second one. I asked what the risks were. She said we could lose. We could spend $8,000 we didn't have and end up with nothing. Or worse, we could make Melissa so angry she'd move out of state and take Ryan with her. Some states would allow that during an ongoing custody dispute. I asked what she'd do if it was her nephew. She said she'd fight. She said bullies like Melissa's father count on people being too tired or too scared or too broke to push back. She said the moment someone pushes back with proof, they fold. Not always, but often enough. I told her I needed to talk to my son first. She said, don't wait too long. The next supervised visit was in 12 days. If my son showed up looking unstable, if the social worker wrote the wrong thing in her report, Melissa's lawyer would use it to justify suspending visits entirely. We were out of time. I called my son that night. I asked him to meet me for coffee the next morning. Not at my house, somewhere neutral. He said, okay. We met at a diner off the interstate, the kind with cracked vinyl booths and coffee that tasted like it had been sitting since dawn. I brought the folder. I slid it across the table and told him to read. He opened it. I watched his face change. Shock first, then anger, then something that looked like relief. Like he'd been drowning, and someone finally threw him a rope. He asked where I got this. I told him. He asked if it was legal. I told him it was public record. Anyone could have requested it. He asked why his lawyer never showed him this. I said, because his lawyer was overworked and underpaid, and probably never looked hard enough. He asked what we were supposed to do with it. I told him about his aunt, about the bar complaint, about the emergency review, about the 30 days and the $8,000 and the risk that we'd lose everything. He closed the folder. He said he didn't have $8,000. I said I did, not liquid, but I had a retirement account. I could take a hardship withdrawal. I'd lose some to taxes and penalties, but I'd have enough. He said no. He said he couldn't let me do that. I said it wasn't his choice. I said I'd watched him sleep in a car and eat toast for dinner, and I wasn't doing it anymore. I said Melissa's family used money as a weapon, and I was going to use money as a shield. He looked at me like I'd lost my mind. Maybe I had. He asked what happened if we filed and lost. I said we'd be broke, and Melissa would be furious, and we'd probably never see Ryan again. He asked what happened if we filed and won. I said he'd get real custody, overnight visits, a say in Ryan's education and medical care, a chance to be a father instead of a supervised stranger. He asked what happened to the money either way. I said it was gone, spent. I'd be working a few more years before I could retire, but I'd done harder things. He asked if I was sure. I said I'd never been more sure of anything. We sat there while his coffee went cold. He asked if his aunt really thought we could win. I said she thought we had a legitimate case. She thought Melissa's father's firm had overreached. She thought a bar complaint would scare them enough to settle before it went to a hearing. But she also said we needed to be prepared for the worst. We needed to be prepared for Melissa to fight back with everything she had. Her father's reputation was on the line. He wouldn't go down quietly. He'd hire investigators. He'd find every mistake my son ever made, every late payment, every argument, every bad moment, and he'd use it. He'd try to make us look like we were harassing his daughter. He'd try to make the bar complaint look like retaliation. He'd try to win in the court of public opinion, even if he lost in actual court. My son asked if I was ready for that. I said I'd been a widow for 8 years and worked in a county office where people yelled at me about property taxes and parking tickets. I said I'd survived worse than a lawyer with an ego. He almost smiled. Then he asked about Ryan. He asked what happened when an 8-year-old boy was in the middle of a legal war between his parents. I didn't have a good answer for that. The truth was, Ryan would hear things. He'd feel the tension. He'd ask questions nobody wanted to answer. But he was already hearing things. He was already being told his father was a failure and his grandmother was toxic. At least this way, maybe eventually, he'd learn the truth. My son said, okay. He said if I was willing to risk my retirement, he was willing to risk everything else. We shook hands across a diner table like we were signing a contract. Then I drove home and called his aunt back. I told her we were in. She said she'd start drafting the paperwork. She said she needed a retainer of $3,000 to get started. The rest would come due as we moved through the process. She said once we filed, we couldn't take it back. Once the bar complaint went in, Melissa's father would know. He'd prepare, he'd counterattack. We needed to be ready to see this through to the end, whatever that looked like. I transferred the money that afternoon. My hands were shaking when I logged into my retirement account. I'd been contributing to it for 23 years. It wasn't much, maybe $70,000 total. I'd planned to retire at 65 and live on that plus Social Security and maybe a part-time job doing something easy. Taking out $8,000 meant penalties and taxes. It meant probably $10,000 gone when it was all calculated. It meant working until I was 68, maybe 70. It meant no cruise, no new car, no comfortable cushion. But it meant my son might get to see his kid. It meant my grandson might learn his father wasn't a failure. It meant standing up to people who thought money made them untouchable. I hit submit. The paperwork took a week to draft. His aunt was thorough. The bar complaint outlined 4 instances of procedural misconduct, submitting contradictory financial documents, making false claims about missed child support payments, misrepresenting my son's cooperation with discovery requests, and improperly influencing the custody evaluation process by filing a baseless motion to disregard it. Each instance was backed by exhibits, bank records, email timestamps, court filings, the evaluator's original report. It was 23 pages of carefully documented evidence that Melissa's father's firm had bent the rules to guarantee a win. The emergency motion to modify custody was shorter but sharper. It argued that the original custody order was based on fraudulent representations. It argued that my son had been denied due process because his attorney hadn't had the resources to properly challenge the misconduct. It argued that Ryan's best interests were being harmed by a custody arrangement that limited his access to a fit and loving parent based on lies. It requested an immediate hearing to reconsider the custody structure and to allow my son unsupervised visitation pending that hearing. His aunt filed both documents on a Monday morning. She called me an hour later. She said it was done. She said we should expect a response within 72 hours. She said Melissa's father would likely call her directly to try to negotiate before things got messy. She said if he did, she'd tell him we weren't interested in negotiation. We were interested in truth and fairness and a custody arrangement that reflected reality instead of fiction. She said to tell my son to keep his head down, keep going to work, keep documenting everything. No angry texts, no late-night calls to Melissa. No public posts on social media. We needed to be beyond reproach. The response came faster than expected. Melissa's father called his aunt 36 hours after we filed. She put him on speaker so I could hear. His voice was smooth, practiced, the kind of voice that made you feel like you were the unreasonable one for questioning him. He said this was unnecessary. He said we were wasting everyone's time and money over a settled case. He said my son had agreed to the terms of the divorce and couldn't just change his mind because he regretted his choices. His aunt said my son hadn't agreed to terms based on fraudulent evidence. There was a pause. Then he said the word fraudulent was inflammatory and inappropriate. She said it was accurate. He said he'd hate to see this turn into a public spectacle. She said that sounded like a threat. He said it was simply a concern for everyone's privacy and reputation. She said if he was so concerned about reputation, maybe he should reconsider his firm's filing practices. He hung up. His aunt laughed. She said that went exactly as she expected. She said now he was scared. He was going to go back to his office and pull every file his firm had submitted in the past 5 years to make sure there weren't other cases where they'd played fast and loose with the rules. He was going to realize we had him cornered. And he was going to try to make us go away before the bar started asking questions. She said we should expect an offer, a settlement, something that looked generous, but came with conditions. She said whatever he offered, we should say no, unless it included real custody for my son. The offer came 3 days later, a formal letter from Melissa's father's firm. They proposed increasing my son's visitation to every other weekend, unsupervised, in exchange for us dropping the bar complaint and agreeing not to pursue further modification of the custody arrangement for 2 years. They also offered to forgive $2,000 in disputed expenses Melissa claimed my son owed. His aunt read it over the phone. She said it was insulting. She said every other weekend was the bare minimum the original custody evaluation had recommended. She said, forgiving expenses he never actually owed wasn't a concession. She said the 2-year freeze on modifications was designed to let them wait us out until we couldn't afford to fight anymore. She said we should counter. We countered with shared custody, equal time, alternating weeks, joint decision-making on education and medical care, my son's name restored to Ryan's school contact list and medical release forms, no restrictions on his ability to communicate with Ryan between visits. And the bar complaint stayed active unless Melissa's father's firm issued a public correction acknowledging the errors in their original filings. His aunt said that last part would never happen, but it was important to ask for it. It put pressure on them. It reminded them that we weren't just fighting for custody. We were fighting for accountability. They rejected our counter within hours, said it was a non-starter, said Melissa would never agree to equal time, said the bar complaint was frivolous and we'd regret pursuing it. His aunt said good. She said now we go to the hearing. The emergency custody review was scheduled for 3 weeks out. That gave us 3 weeks to prepare. 3 weeks for my son to find an apartment so he could prove stable housing. 3 weeks for us to line up character witnesses who could testify that he was a good father and Melissa's claims were baseless. 3 weeks to hope the judge assigned to the case wasn't another one of her father's friends. My son found an apartment in 12 days, a small 1-bedroom in a complex near the highway. It wasn't much, thin walls, a parking lot that always had broken glass. But it had a lease and a kitchen and a bathroom that locked. He paid first month, last month, and a security deposit using the last of his savings and a loan from his aunt. He sent photos to his lawyer showing a clean space with a bed and a small table, and Ryan's name on a paper taped to the door of what would be his room. Not a room, really. A corner with a sleeping bag and a lamp, but it was something. It was proof he wasn't living in his car anymore. The character witnesses were harder. Most of my son's friends had drifted away during the divorce. Some believed Melissa's version of events. Some just didn't want to get involved. But we found 3 people willing to testify. His former boss from the distribution company, who said my son had never missed a day of work and had been a model employee for 15 years. A neighbor from the old house, who said my son had been the one outside playing catch with Ryan every evening while Melissa worked late. And Ryan's second-grade teacher, who said my son had attended every parent-teacher conference and volunteered for classroom activities even after the separation. It wasn't a lot, but it was something. The hearing was on a Thursday. We arrived at the courthouse at 8 in the morning, even though we weren't scheduled until 9:30. The building smelled like floor wax and recycled air. We sat on a bench in the hallway outside the family court division. My son wore the same suit he'd been sleeping in that day I found him in the parking lot, but now it was cleaned and pressed. His aunt sat beside him, reviewing notes. I sat on his other side, trying not to throw up. At 9:15, Melissa arrived with her father and her lawyer. She looked perfect, hair done, makeup subtle, a navy dress that said, "Responsible parent." She didn't look at us. Her father looked at us plenty. He had that same smooth confidence, like this was all very tedious, but he'd humor us. We were called in at 9:40. The judge was a woman in her 50s with reading glasses on a chain and a face that gave nothing away. She asked us to sit. She said she'd reviewed both motions and the supporting documents. She said she had some questions. She looked at Melissa's father's lawyer first. She asked him to explain the discrepancy between the financial records his firm had submitted and the bank statements from the county clerk's office. The lawyer said there must have been a clerical error. The judge asked when the error was discovered. He said recently. She asked why it hadn't been corrected. He said they were in the process of filing an amendment. She made a note. She asked about the claim that my son had missed child support payments. The lawyer said that was based on information provided by his client. The judge asked if he'd verified that information against bank records. He said he'd relied on his client's representations. The judge asked if he understood that attorneys have a duty to verify factual claims before submitting them to the court. He said yes, but that extenuating circumstances had made verification difficult. The judge asked what circumstances. He didn't have a good answer. She made another note. She turned to Melissa. She asked if she was aware her attorney had submitted inaccurate information to the court. Melissa said she'd provided what she believed to be accurate information. The judge asked if she'd reviewed the bank statements before claiming my son had missed payments. Melissa said she didn't have access to all the accounts. The judge pointed out they were joint accounts. Melissa said she'd been focused on Ryan's needs and hadn't had time to review every detail. The judge said these weren't details. These were facts that determined custody. Melissa's face tightened. The judge asked my son about his housing situation. He said he'd recently secured an apartment. She asked where he'd been living before that. He hesitated. His aunt whispered something. He said he'd been temporarily staying in his car while saving for a deposit. The judge asked how long. He said 3 weeks. She asked why he hadn't sought help sooner. He said he'd been afraid it would be used against him in custody proceedings. She asked if anyone had threatened him. He said yes. He said his ex-wife had told him that involving his mother or asking for help would result in loss of visitation rights. The judge asked if he had documentation of that threat. He said no. It had been verbal. Melissa's lawyer objected, said my son was making unfounded accusations. The judge said she wasn't interested in, she said she was interested in facts. She asked Melissa if she'd ever told my son that seeking help from his mother would affect his custody. Melissa said she'd expressed concern that his mother had a history of enabling poor decisions. The judge asked what that meant. Melissa said I'd encouraged my son to leave the marriage instead of working on it. The judge asked if she had proof. Melissa said it was common knowledge in the family. The judge said common knowledge wasn't evidence. The hearing went on for 2 hours. Every claim Melissa's father's firm had made got picked apart. The missed payments that weren't actually missed. The hidden assets that didn't exist. The refusal to cooperate with discovery that was contradicted by email timestamps. The emergency motion to disregard the custody evaluation that had been filed without proper grounds. By the time we broke for lunch, Melissa's lawyer looked like he'd been run over. Her father looked furious. Melissa looked scared. We reconvened at 1. The judge said she'd made a decision. She said the original custody order had been based on materially inaccurate information. She said that while she couldn't speak to whether the inaccuracies were intentional or negligent, they were serious enough to warrant modification. She said she was ordering a new custody evaluation to be completed within 60 days. In the meantime, she was granting my son unsupervised visitation every other weekend with the possibility of midweek dinners. She was also ordering both parties to attend co-parenting mediation to establish better communication. And she was referring the case file to the state bar for review of the filings submitted by Melissa's father's firm. Melissa's father stood up. He said he wanted to object. The judge said he could file a motion to reconsider, but she doubted it would change her decision. She said the evidence was clear. She said officers of the court had a responsibility to ensure accurate information was presented, and that responsibility had not been met. She said she expected better. He sat down. Melissa started crying. Not loud, just quiet tears that made her mascara run. Her lawyer put a hand on her shoulder. The judge said court was adjourned. We walked out into the hallway. My son looked like he couldn't breathe. His aunt hugged him. I hugged him. He said he got to see Ryan this weekend, unsupervised. He could take him to the park. He could take him for ice cream. He could be a dad instead of a supervised visitor. His aunt said this was just the beginning. The new custody evaluation would take time. The bar review would take longer. But we'd won the first round. We'd proven the original case was built on lies. Now we just had to prove my son deserved equal custody. She said it would still cost money. Maybe another $5,000 for the evaluation and the mediation. I said I'd handle it. She said I'd already given enough. I said, not yet, I hadn't. The first unsupervised visit happened that Saturday. My son picked Ryan up at 10 in the morning from Melissa's house. She answered the door with her arms crossed. Ryan stood behind her, looking confused. My son knelt down and asked if he wanted to go to the park. Ryan nodded. Melissa said he needed to be back by 4. My son said the court order said 6. She said 4 was better for Ryan's routine. My son said 6 was what the judge ordered. She stared at him. Then she told Ryan to get his shoes. Ryan ran inside. Melissa leaned closer and said if anything happened to her son, if he came back upset or hurt, she'd make sure this was the last unsupervised visit. My son said nothing would happen. Ryan came back with his shoes and a backpack. They left. My son took him to the park near my house, the one with the big wooden play structure and the swings that went high enough to make your stomach drop. Ryan was quiet at first. He asked why he hadn't seen Daddy in so long. My son said grown-up stuff had gotten complicated. Ryan asked if Daddy was mad at Mommy. My son said no. Ryan asked if Mommy was mad at Daddy. My son said maybe a little, but it wasn't Ryan's fault. Ryan asked if Daddy still loved him. My son said more than anything in the world. Ryan asked if he could come to Daddy's new apartment. My son said yes. Maybe next time. Ryan smiled. It was the first real smile my son had seen in months. They got ice cream. They threw a football. They sat on a bench, and Ryan talked about school and his friend Marcus and the science project he was working on about volcanoes. My son listened, really listened. Not the distracted listening of a tired parent, but the full attention listening of someone who'd almost lost this. At 5:30 they headed back. Ryan asked if they could do this again. My son said yes, every other weekend, maybe more once the new evaluation was done. Ryan asked what that meant. My son said it meant a nice lady would ask him questions about what he wanted. Ryan asked what he should say. My son said whatever was true. Ryan thought about that. Then he said he wanted to see Daddy more. My son hugged him so hard Ryan squeaked. Melissa opened the door at exactly 6 o'clock. Ryan ran inside talking about the park and the ice cream. She looked at my son like she was waiting for him to say something that would justify taking it all away again. He just said thank you and turned to leave. She called after him. She said this didn't change anything. She said the evaluation would show Ryan was better off with her full time. She said her father's firm made a few clerical errors, but the judge had overreacted. She said once things calmed down, everything would go back to normal. My son said normal was him being Ryan's father. She closed the door. The custody evaluation started 3 weeks later. A woman named Dr. Brennan from the Family Services Department met with each of them separately, then together, then with Ryan alone. She visited my son's apartment. She visited Melissa's house. She reviewed school records, medical records, financial documents, character references. She interviewed me. She interviewed Melissa's mother. She interviewed Ryan's teacher and his pediatrician. She took notes, lots of notes. My son said it felt like being on trial. His aunt said that's because he was. But this time, the trial was fair. Dr. Brennan's report came back 8 weeks later, 47 pages. She found that both parents were fit and capable. She found that Ryan had strong bonds with both parents, but expressed a desire for more time with his father. She found that the current custody arrangement was overly restrictive, given the evidence of the father's parenting capacity. She found that Melissa's claims about emotional abuse were not supported by interviews or observations. She found that Ryan would benefit from a more balanced schedule. She recommended a 60-40 split, favoring Melissa only because Ryan's primary residence and school were in her district, but with the father having every other week from Thursday through Sunday, plus alternating holidays and 4 weeks in summer. She recommended joint decision-making on all major issues. She recommended lifting all supervision requirements. Melissa's lawyer filed an objection, said Dr. Brennan was biased, said she'd relied too heavily on my son's testimony, said Ryan was too young to know what he really wanted. The judge reviewed the objection and denied it. She said Dr. Brennan was a court-appointed evaluator with 20 years of experience and no demonstrated bias. She said Ryan was old enough to express preferences even if he couldn't make final decisions. She said the objection appeared to be a delay tactic. She adopted Dr. Brennan's recommendations, effective immediately. That meant my son got Ryan for 4 days out of every 2 weeks. It meant holidays would be split evenly. It meant Ryan could call his dad whenever he wanted. It meant my son got to be involved in school conferences and doctor appointments and decisions about sports and summer camp. It meant he wasn't a visitor anymore. He was a parent. The bar review took longer. 6 months of investigation, interviews with both parties, review of all case files handled by Melissa's father's firm over the past 3 years. They found a pattern, not fraud exactly, but aggressive interpretation of facts, selective presentation of evidence, failure to verify client claims. They issued a formal reprimand. Melissa's father had to take continuing education courses on ethics and procedure. His firm had to pay a fine. It wasn't a disbarment. It wasn't even a suspension, but it was public. It went in his record. It damaged his reputation among family law judges who now knew to scrutinize his filings more carefully. For a man who'd built his career on winning, it was humiliating. Melissa stopped fighting after that. She and my son settled into a cold but functional co-parenting relationship. They used a shared calendar app for scheduling. They communicated through brief emails about logistics. They didn't attend Ryan's events together, but they didn't make scenes either. Ryan adjusted. He had 2 bedrooms now, 2 sets of toys, 2 routines. It wasn't perfect. Sometimes he got confused about which house he was supposed to be at. Sometimes he said he missed mommy when he was with daddy or missed daddy when he was with mommy. But he stopped asking whose fault the divorce was. He stopped worrying about being the reason his parents didn't talk. He just lived his life. I saw Ryan again the weekend after the new custody order went into effect. My son brought him to my house for Sunday dinner. Ryan ran through the door like he'd never left, asking if I still had the good cookies. I did. We sat at the kitchen table, the 3 of us, and ate pot roast and mashed potatoes. Ryan told me about his volcano project. He showed me a drawing he'd made of our family. Him in the middle, my son on one side holding a football, me on the other side holding a plate of cookies. No Melissa, no grandmother from her side, just us. I put it on the fridge next to the old drawings I'd kept for 8 years. My son asked Ryan if he wanted to stay over next weekend. Ryan said yes. My son said they'd need to go shopping for the extra room in his apartment. Maybe get a real bed instead of a sleeping bag. Maybe get some posters for the walls. Ryan asked if he could pick the posters. My son said absolutely. Ryan asked if Grandma could come shopping with them. My son looked at me. I said I'd love to. Ryan hugged me. His arms barely made it around my waist, but he squeezed hard. He smelled like shampoo and playground dirt and everything good in the world. That night after they left, I sat in my quiet house and thought about the parking lot, about finding my son in the back of his car, about the folder full of documents that proved he'd been telling the truth all along, about the $8,000 I'd pulled from my retirement account. I'd have to work a few more years. I'd have to skip some things I'd looked forward to, but I got to see my grandson again. I got to watch my son be a father. I got to prove that money and lawyers and polished stories don't always win. Sometimes proof wins. Sometimes stubbornness wins. Sometimes love wins even when the cost is high. The bar reprimand made local news. Small article, buried on page 6, but enough that people noticed. Enough that Melissa's father's firm lost a few clients. Enough that the next time someone in family court saw his name on a filing, they looked a little closer. That's all we wanted. Not revenge, not humiliation, just accountability. Just a little bit of fairness in a system that often rewards whoever can afford the most billable hours. I went back to work at the county office. Same desk, same paperwork, same people complaining about permits and tax assessments. But something felt different. I felt different. I'd spent 32 years being careful, being quiet, not making waves, raising my son, burying my husband, showing up on time, doing my job, going home. I'd thought that was enough. I'd thought keeping your head down and following the rules meant you'd be treated fairly. But fairness isn't something you receive. It's something you fight for. And sometimes fighting costs everything you've saved. My retirement account sits at $62,000 now instead of $70,000. I'll be working until I'm 69, maybe 70. The roof still leaks. The water heater still makes that grinding sound. I drive past the travel agency on Route 14 sometimes and look at the posters in the window. Cruise ships, European cities, beaches with white sand. I used to imagine myself on one of those trips. Now I imagine Ryan graduating high school. I imagine my son walking him to the car on his first day of college. I imagine being there for it. That's worth more than a cruise. Melissa's mother stopped speaking to me entirely. We used to exchange polite nods at Ryan's school events back before the divorce. Now she looks through me like I'm glass. Her friends do the same. The women from her church group. The book club ladies who used to smile at me in the grocery store. I've become the villain in their version of the story. The mother-in-law who couldn't let go. The troublemaker who dragged a good family through unnecessary legal drama. Let them think that. I know what I saw in that parking lot. I know what the documents proved. Their opinion doesn't change the truth. My son rebuilt his life slowly. He got a promotion at work 8 months after the custody order changed. Not a big one. Just a shift supervisor position with a small raise, but it meant steadier hours and enough extra income to move to a better apartment in a complex with a pool and a playground. Ryan got his own real bedroom, blue walls, posters of planets and astronauts, a bookshelf my son built from a kit, a desk for homework. Ryan told me it felt like a real home. That broke my heart and healed it at the same time. The supervised visit center closed Ryan's case file. No more social workers taking notes. No more sterile rooms with educational posters on the walls. My son could take Ryan wherever he wanted. Movies, hiking trails, the science museum 2 towns over, my house for Sunday dinner. Normal things, parent things. The first time Ryan slept over at my house after the custody change, he asked if he could stay in his dad's old room. I'd kept it mostly the same. Different bedding, no posters, but the same furniture, the same window that looked out on the backyard. Ryan said it was cool sleeping in the room where his dad grew up. He said it made him feel like he was part of something bigger than just right now. Thanksgiving that first year was awkward. Ryan was supposed to be with Melissa. She'd gotten Thanksgiving in the custody agreement, and my son had gotten Christmas Eve and Christmas Day. But Ryan asked if Grandma could come to Thanksgiving at Mommy's house. Melissa said no. Ryan asked why. She said it was complicated. Ryan said he didn't understand. She said maybe when he was older. Ryan told my son about it during their next visit. My son said sometimes grown-ups have trouble getting along, but it didn't mean anyone stopped loving Ryan. Ryan asked if that meant he'd have 2 Thanksgivings when he was older. My son said maybe. Ryan said that sounded okay. 2 of everything wasn't so bad when you thought about it. Christmas was at my house. My son, Ryan, his aunt, who'd handled the legal case. She'd driven 6 hours to spend the holiday with us. We had a small tree in the corner of the living room, lights that blinked, ornaments Ryan made out of construction paper and glitter. We cooked too much food. Turkey, stuffing, green bean casserole, rolls that came from a can. Ryan opened presents in his pajamas while it was still dark outside. A telescope from his dad, a science kit from me, books from his great aunt about space exploration. He spent the whole day looking at Saturn through the telescope from the backyard, even though it was freezing and he could barely hold still long enough to focus. That night, after Ryan fell asleep on the couch, my son and his aunt and I sat in the kitchen, drinking coffee that had gone lukewarm. His aunt said she was proud of us, said most people would have given up, Said Melissa's father had built a career on people giving up. My son said he'd almost given up. He said if I hadn't found him in that parking lot, if I hadn't made those copies, if I hadn't been willing to drain my retirement account, he'd probably still be sleeping in his car and seeing his son 2 hours a week. He said he didn't know how to thank me. I said he didn't have to. I said that's what mothers do. We show up. We fight. We pay the cost. His aunt said the bar reprimand had consequences we probably didn't even know about. She said word travels in legal circles. She said Melissa's father's firm had been known for aggressive family law tactics, and now they were known for cutting corners. She said that would follow them. She said it wouldn't destroy them, but it would slow them down. She said maybe the next father living in his car would have a fairer fight because a judge would scrutinize the other side's paperwork a little harder. I hadn't thought about it that way. I'd been so focused on my son and Ryan that I didn't think about the ripples. But maybe that's how things change. Not all at once, just small cracks in systems that seemed unbreakable. Ryan turned 9 in March. My son threw him a birthday party at the apartment complex. Kids from school came. Pizza, cake, a piñata, shaped like a rocket ship. Melissa dropped him off and picked him up without coming inside. My son said that was fine. He didn't need her approval anymore. He just needed her to coexist. She could do that. Barely. But barely was enough. Ryan blew out his candles and made a wish. My son asked what he wished for. Ryan said you're not supposed to tell, or it won't come true. My son said that was probably smart. Later, Ryan whispered to me that he'd wished for a dog. I whispered back that maybe he should mention that to his dad. Ryan grinned. They got the dog in June. A rescue mutt from the county shelter. Brown and white, floppy ears. Ryan named him Orbit. Melissa said dogs were a lot of responsibility. My son said they'd manage. Ryan walked Orbit every morning before school during his weeks with his dad. He fed him. He taught him to sit and shake. He slept with him curled up at the foot of his bed. Melissa eventually allowed Ryan to bring Orbit to her house during his weeks there. She said the dog was better behaved than she expected. That was the closest thing to a compliment she'd given my son in 2 years. I see Ryan twice a month now. Sometimes more if my son needs help with pickup or if there's a school event. I go to his science fairs, his soccer games even though he's not very good and spends most of the time picking grass, his school concerts where he plays the recorder off-key with 40 other 4th graders. Normal grandparent things. I keep drawings on my fridge. I keep photos on my mantle. I keep his favorite cookies in the cabinet. Melissa's mother is usually at the same events. We don't speak. We don't sit near each other. But we're both there for Ryan. That's what matters. My son started dating someone last fall. A woman he met at work. She's patient, kind. She doesn't push. She met Ryan in January at a casual lunch. Ryan liked her. Said she was funny. Said she didn't try too hard. My son seems lighter when he talks about her. Not like he's trying to replace what he lost. Just like he's learning to build something new. I haven't met her yet. He says he wants to make sure it's serious first. I said I'd be there whenever he was ready. He said he knew. He said that's what got him through the worst of it. Knowing I'd be there. We don't talk about the parking lot much anymore. Sometimes it comes up. A reference. A joke that's not quite a joke. Remember when you lived in your car? Ryan asked once, not understanding the weight of it. My son said yes. Ryan asked why. My son said sometimes grown-ups go through hard times. Ryan asked if it was scary. My son said yes. Ryan asked if it was okay now. My son said yes. Ryan went back to playing with Orbit. My son looked at me across the table. I looked back. We didn't need to say anything. We both knew how close we'd come to losing everything. The county office is the same. I still process permits. I still answer questions about tax assessments. I still take my lunch break at noon and eat a sandwich at my desk while scrolling through emails. But when people ask me about my grandson now, I pull out photos. I tell them about his science projects and his dog and his off-key recorder concerts. I don't hesitate. I don't wonder if I'm allowed to be proud. I just am. He's my grandson. I fought for the right to say that out loud. Not in court, not on paper, just in my life, in my choices. In the willingness to spend money, I didn't have to make sure the truth mattered more than the story. Sunday dinners are a tradition now. My son brings Ryan every other week. We eat at my old kitchen table. We talk about school and work and nothing important. Orbit lies under the table hoping for dropped food. Ryan does his homework while my son and I clean up dishes. Sometimes Ryan asks about his grandfather, the one he never met. I tell him stories, how his grandfather fixed cars, how he told terrible jokes, how he loved his son more than anything, how he would have loved Ryan too. Ryan listens. He asks questions. He's building a picture of a man who existed before he did. That's legacy. Not money, not property, just memory passed down. I keep a folder in my desk drawer, the copies I made, the bank statements, the emails, the custody evaluation. I don't look at it often, but I know it's there. Proof that we weren't crazy. Proof that we were right to fight. Proof that sometimes the system works if you're willing to push it. I'll probably keep that folder until I'm gone. Maybe my son will find it someday when he's cleaning out my house. Maybe he'll show Ryan when he's old enough to understand. Maybe it'll just get thrown away with the rest of the paper trails we leave behind. It doesn't matter. What matters is what it did, not what it is now. I still think about retirement sometimes, about what I gave up, the trips I won't take, the extra years I'll work, the cushion I won't have. But then Ryan runs through my door asking if I have cookies, and my son sits at my table looking like he remembers how to smile, and I think about the alternative, the parking lot, the supervised visits, the slow erasure of our family by people who had more money and fewer scruples. I chose this. I chose proof over comfort. I chose truth over ease. I'd choose it again. Melissa's father still practices law. His firm still handles family cases, but I hear things through the county office. Cases where judges ask more questions. Cases where financial documents get scrutinized. Cases where fathers don't get steamrolled quite as easily. Maybe that's because of us. Maybe it's not. Maybe it's just the system correcting itself one small degree at a time. Either way, I know we mattered. We stood up. We showed proof. We refused to disappear quietly into the story someone else wrote. There's a photo on my mantle now. My son, Ryan, and me at Ryan's 9th birthday. We're outside the apartment complex. Ryan is in the middle holding orbit. We're all smiling. Real smiles. Not the kind you force for a camera. The kind that happen because you're exactly where you want to be with exactly who you want to be with. I look at that photo every morning when I'm getting ready for work. It reminds me why I'm still setting an alarm, why I'm still processing permits and answering phones, why I'm working towards 69 instead of 65. That photo cost me $8,000 and 3 years of retirement. Best money I ever spent. If this story has touched your heart, subscribe now, leave a like, and tell me in the comments what city you're watching from. That helps us keep sharing stories of strong women, families, and the unexpected turns of life. Remember, this is a dramatized fictional story for entertainment only. It does not provide legal, medical, or financial advice.